They chose the adopted son, so they sent him to prison. They didn't know he owned everything. I have thought about where to start this story for a long time. Not because the beginning is hard to find, it isn't. The beginning is the clearest part. It is the night my brother called the police and told them I had stolen from the family business. The night my mother sat 3 feet away from me and said nothing. The night my father, the man who had signed the papers, who had chosen me, who had driven 4 hours to bring me home when I was 7 years old, looked at the detective and nodded, slowly, like a man confirming something he had always half expected. That is where this starts. Not in the courtroom, not in the prison cell, not in the lawyer's office 2 years later when everything came apart for them in the way that things come apart when they are built on a lie. It starts in the living room of the house I grew up in, on a Tuesday night in November, with my hands on the kitchen table and my brother standing by the door with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that I recognized immediately. Relief. That is what I saw on Daniel's face that night. Not guilt, not conflict, not even the decency of shame. Relief. Like something he had been waiting for had finally arrived. I want to tell this story as honestly as I can, which means I have to tell you about the parts that don't make me look like a simple victim. Because I was not a simple victim. I was a person, complicated and imperfect, who was betrayed by people who were also complicated and imperfect, and the truth lives somewhere in that complexity rather than in a clean story of good and evil. I have spent 2 years learning that. I am still learning it. But I was also innocent of what they accused me of. That part is not complicated at all. My name is Ethan. I was adopted at 7 by the Calloway family, Richard and Margaret Calloway, and their biological son Daniel, who was 9 at the time and had apparently asked for a dog. I say that without bitterness, or at least I try to. Daniel told me that himself when we were teenagers, during a fight that got ugly the way teenage fights do, things said specifically to wound, chosen for maximum damage. You know, I asked for a dog, he said. At least a dog would have been grateful. I don't think he meant it entirely. People say things in anger that are partly true and partly just weapons grabbed in a hurry. But partly true was enough. I filed it away in that place where you keep the things that confirm what you already suspected about yourself, that you were an addition, an experiment, a choice that someone made and then had to live with. Richard Calloway was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that. He was a man who had more love in his intentions than in his execution. Which is a common enough failure and a painful one to grow up inside of. He brought me home with every intention of treating me the same as Daniel. He said the right things. He showed up to the right events. He signed the right papers. But there is a difference between treating someone equally and feeling the same about them. You cannot manufacture that feeling. You can perform it, for years, with great consistency, and still have it absent from your eyes when you look at one child versus another. I knew the difference by the time I was 10. Children always do. Margaret was warmer, in her way. She touched my shoulder sometimes when she passed me in the kitchen. She remembered the things I liked. But she was also a woman who had built her life around Richard's decisions, and when Richard's decisions moved in one direction, Margaret moved with them. That is not a criticism. That is just what I observed, over 20 years of watching them. Daniel is the complicated one. We were not close, but we were not enemies. Not for most of it. We shared a house for 11 years, and in that time we developed the particular relationship of two people who did not choose each other but have to negotiate the same space, a relationship built more on truth than on love, more on habit than on warmth. We watched the same TV shows. We ate at the same table. We went to the same school and moved in different circles and occasionally acknowledged each other in the hallway with a nod of people who share a secret that neither of them particularly wants. The secret, in our case, was simply this: the family worked better in theory than in practice. Better in the version Richard told at dinner parties, we always wanted to give a child a home, than in the version that lived in the silences, in the slightly longer hugs Margaret gave Daniel, in the way Richard's face changed when he talked about his son versus when he talked about his boys. I understood it. I even, eventually, accepted it. Not every family is what it says it is on the outside. That is not a tragedy unique to adopted children. It is just the ordinary gap between the story people tell about themselves and the life they actually live. What I did not accept, what I could not have prepared for, was what Daniel did when money became involved. The Calloway family business was a mid-sized construction company that Richard had built over 30 years. Solid, unglamorous, successful in the way that unglamorous things often are, through consistency and reputation rather than innovation. When I was 23, fresh out of college with a business degree I had paid for myself through scholarships and part-time work, Richard offered me a position. Not out of generosity, I understood later. Out of necessity. The company needed someone who could modernize its financial systems, and Daniel, who had coasted through a communications degree on Richard's money and charm, was not that person. I took the job. I was good at it. Over the next 5 years I restructured the company's accounting, brought in 2 major contracts that tripled the annual revenue, and built a financial management system that the company still runs on today. I know that last part because I own the licensing rights to the software. I built it on my own time, on my own equipment, and I was careful, meticulous, almost paranoid, about documenting that separation. I was careful because I had learned, growing up in that house, to protect what was mine. When you are the child who was chosen rather than born, you develop an instinct for ownership, for knowing exactly what belongs to you and what doesn't, for keeping records, for never assuming that goodwill is permanent. It is not a pleasant way to live. But it is a useful one. I had also, over those 5 years, quietly acquired a 31% stake in the company itself. Not through inheritance, not through a gift, through a series of legitimate share purchases over several years, using money I had earned and saved. Richard knew. He had signed off on each transaction, in the distracted way that men sign things when they trust the person presenting them and don't read the details carefully enough. Daniel did not know. That turned out to be the center of everything. The trouble started when Richard had his first heart attack. Minor, the doctors said, a warning. But warnings have a way of making people move faster toward things they have been putting off, and what Richard had been putting off was the question of succession. Who would run the company when he couldn't? The answer, in Richard's mind, had always been Daniel. I understood that too. Whatever my contributions, whatever the numbers said, there was something in Richard that needed the company to go to his son. The biological one. The one who shared his name and his blood and the particular shape of his jaw. I do not think Richard was a bad man for feeling that. I think he was a human one. What I did not expect was the method. Daniel came to me one evening in April, came to my apartment, which he had never done before, which should have told me something. He sat on my couch with a drink in his hand and talked for 20 minutes about family and legacy and what Richard wanted. He was careful and reasonable and kind in the way that people are kind when they want something. And then he told me that Richard wanted me to sign over my shares. That the family thought it would be cleaner, going forward, if the ownership was consolidated. That they would compensate me fairly. I said I would think about it. I did not think about it for long, because 2 days later I called my lawyer, a woman named Claire who I had met through a professional connection 3 years earlier and who remains the sharpest person I have ever encountered in any room, and she told me, very calmly, exactly what signing over those shares would mean. Exactly what I would be giving up. Exactly what the company's current valuation implied about the worth of a 31% stake. I called Daniel and told him I wouldn't be signing anything. 3 weeks later, the police came to my apartment. The accusation was embezzlement. Specifically, that I had been diverting company funds into a personal account over a period of 18 months. The amounts were significant enough to be criminal, carefully chosen to be just plausible enough given my access to the financial systems. The evidence had been constructed with patience and some intelligence. Someone had taken the time to understand how our accounting system worked, where the gaps were, how transactions could be made to look like something they weren't. Someone who had watched me build the system and had paid attention. I sat in an interrogation room for 4 hours and told the truth, which is what innocent people do and which helps less than you would expect. Truth without proof is just a story. And the proof, on the surface, pointed in my direction. Claire was there within 2 hours of my call. She sat across from me in that room and listened to everything I said with an expression that gave nothing away, and when I was done she asked me 3 questions, about the documentation I had kept, about the timestamps on certain transactions, about a specific account number she had already identified as anomalous. I answered all 3. She nodded once, slowly, and said, "Okay. Don't say anything else to anyone." I was released that night on bail. The trial was set for 8 months out. I went home and sat in my apartment and thought about my mother, about Margaret, sitting 3 feet away from me in that living room and saying nothing. Not defending me. Not asking questions. Not even meeting my eyes. Just sitting with her hands in her lap and her gaze on the floor, the way she sat when Richard had made a decision and the time for discussion was over. I thought about Richard's nod. Slow and certain. A man confirming what he had always half expected. And I thought about Daniel's face. That expression I had recognized immediately and couldn't stop seeing. Relief. The 8 months between the arrest and the trial were the longest of my life and also, in a strange way, the most clarifying. I moved through them with a kind of focus I had never experienced before, not the scattered, anxious focus of someone trying to survive, but the narrow, precise focus of someone who has decided that surviving is not enough. I wanted to be clear. I wanted the record to be complete. I spent those 8 months doing nothing except working with Claire, going through every document, every transaction, every timestamp, every piece of evidence that existed, the manufactured kind and the real kind. Claire found the inconsistencies in the manufactured evidence within 6 weeks. Whoever had built the case against me had been patient and intelligent but not quite careful enough. There were timestamps that didn't align, transaction records that contradicted each other in ways that were invisible to a casual review but obvious when you knew what you were looking for. She also found something else. Something that the person who framed me had not anticipated. I had built the accounting system. I had built it carefully, with redundancies and logs that most people didn't know existed, that recorded every access, every change, every query, with timestamps and user identifications that could not be altered retroactively without leaving traces. I had built those features for legitimate business reasons, for audit purposes, because I had learned to protect what was mine. Those logs showed exactly who had accessed the relevant accounts. Exactly when. Exactly what they had done. The trial lasted 4 days. On the third day, Claire presented the logs. On the fourth day, the prosecution withdrew. I walked out of that courtroom on a Thursday afternoon in March, stood on the steps in the cold, and felt, not triumph. Not the satisfaction you imagine you will feel when something like this is over. Something quieter. Something that felt, more than anything, like exhaustion. Like a long breath finally released. Claire stood next to me and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to do next?" I thought about it for exactly one moment. "Everything," I said. Claire asked me what I wanted to do next, and I said everything, and I meant it in the specific and legal sense of that word. Let me explain what everything meant. The 31% stake in Calloway construction was still mine. The attempt to have me sign it away had failed. The criminal case that was presumably designed to pressure me into signing, or to remove me from the picture entirely, had collapsed. I was still a 31% shareholder in a company currently valued at considerably more than it had been when I started working there. My work, my contracts, my financial restructuring, all of that value was still in the company, and a third of that company still belonged to me. The software licensing agreement was still mine. The system I had built, that the company ran on, that processed every transaction and managed every account, I owned the intellectual property. The license Richard had signed 5 years earlier gave the company the right to use it. It did not give them the right to own it. Claire had reviewed that agreement within the first week of my arrest, and she had looked up from the document and said, very quietly, "Ethan, do you understand what this means?" I understood. And there was one more thing. Something I had not told anyone, not Claire, not anyone, until the morning after the trial ended. Something I had been sitting on for 2 years, through the arrest and the bail and the 8 months of preparation and the 4 days in that courtroom. Something I had kept the way you keep a card you don't play until the right moment, not out of strategy exactly, but out of the instinct of a person who had learned, very young, to hold on to what was his and wait. 18 months before my arrest, I had been approached by a private equity firm about a potential acquisition of Calloway Construction. They had found me through a mutual contact, which was not unusual. I was the person running the company's finances, I was the person whose name was on the major contracts, I was, in practical terms, the person who had built the thing they were interested in buying. We had several conversations. I had been non-committal, because at that point I was still uncertain about what I wanted. But I had been careful. I had documented every conversation. I had kept every email. And 6 months before my arrest, 2 months before Daniel came to my apartment to talk about legacy and family and Richard's wishes, I had signed a preliminary letter of intent with that firm. Non-binding. Confidential. But real. That letter, combined with the share stake, combined with the software licensing agreement, meant that I was sitting on something that the Calloway family had tried to take from me without understanding what it was. They had handed me a weapon and asked me to put it down. And then they had tried to put me in prison. I want to be careful about how I describe what came next, because it is easy to make it sound like a campaign of revenge, and it was not. I did not set out to destroy anyone. I did not plan, sitting on those courthouse steps in March, a sequence of moves designed to bring the Calloway family to their knees. That is not the story. The story is simpler and less dramatic and, I think, more true. I simply stopped protecting them. That is all I did. For 5 years, in ways large and small, I had been making decisions that protected the company, which meant protecting the family, which meant protecting people who, I now understood completely, had never thought of me as one of them in any way that mattered when it mattered. I had structured contracts to benefit the family's long-term interests. I had delayed the conversation with the equity firm because I wasn't sure what I wanted and I didn't want to move too quickly. I had absorbed, quietly and without complaint, the particular indignity of being the most valuable person in a room that didn't fully acknowledge you as belonging there. I stopped doing all of that. I simply let things be what they were. Claire filed the civil suit on a Monday morning in April, 5 weeks after the trial ended. Wrongful accusation. Damage to professional reputation. Emotional distress. The numbers were specific and they were large. The evidence was the same evidence that had ended the criminal trial, the logs, the timestamps, the paper trail that led, clearly and without ambiguity, to Daniel. Richard called me the morning the suit was filed. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more that day. I listened to all 3 messages that evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the way you watch something from a distance when you are no longer inside it. His voice in the first message was controlled. Businesslike. He wanted to talk. He thought we could work something out. He used the word family 3 times in 40 seconds. His voice in the third message was different. Quieter. The control was still there but something underneath it had shifted, a quality I recognized, because I had heard it in my own voice, 8 months earlier, sitting in an interrogation room. The quality of a person who has begun to understand the shape of what is happening to them. I did not call him back. The equity firm re-engaged the week after the civil suit was filed. News travels in business circles, and the news that the company's most significant operational figure had been falsely accused by the family that owned it, that the accusation had collapsed in 4 days of trial, was the kind of news that changes a calculation. They came back with a revised offer. Higher than the original letter of intent. Significantly higher. I brought Claire into those conversations. I also brought in a second attorney, a corporate specialist named Marcus who had been recommended by 3 separate people whose judgment I trusted. The 3 of us sat in a conference room for 2 days and went through every number, every clause, every implication. The acquisition offer valued the company at a number that made the Calloway's 31% buyout offer, the one Daniel had come to my apartment to propose, the one that had started all of this, look almost funny. Not quite funny. But close. My 31% stake, at the acquisition valuation, was worth more than Richard had paid for the entire company when he founded it. The software licensing agreement added another layer. The acquiring firm wanted to own the software outright, not license it. That negotiation was separate, handled separately, and resolved in a way that I found satisfactory. I am being deliberately vague about the specific numbers because those details are not the point of this story and because some of it remains under confidentiality agreements. What I will say is this: I walked out of that process with enough to do whatever I wanted for the rest of my life. Not extravagant, I am not a person who has ever wanted extravagance. But free. Genuinely, completely free in the way that very few people get to be. The Calloways walked out of that process with their share of the acquisition price, minus the civil settlement, minus their legal fees, minus the value of the software licensing that had been running their operations for 5 years and that they had apparently never fully understood they didn't own. It was not nothing. But it was considerably less than it would have been. Daniel, specifically, walked out with almost nothing. His personal legal exposure from the civil suit had required him to liquidate most of his assets. I know this not because I tracked it but because it was a matter of record, public enough that mutual acquaintances mentioned it in passing. He had moved out of the house he'd bought in the suburbs. His wife, they had married 2 years before all of this, had filed for separation 6 months after the civil suit was resolved. I don't know the details of that. I don't need them. Margaret called me once. About 14 months after everything was resolved, on a Sunday afternoon in June. I almost didn't answer. I looked at her name on the screen for a long time, long enough that I'm surprised the call didn't drop, and then I picked up. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that. She didn't say the words. What she said was, I should have said something that night. 6 words. That night. She meant the living room, the kitchen table, the detective with his notepad, Richard's slow nod. She meant the moment she had sat 3 feet away from me and looked at the floor. I sat with those 6 words for a moment. Turned them over. Yes, I said. You should have. There was a long silence. Long enough that I checked the screen to see if the call was still connected. It was. I'm sorry, she said. Finally. Quietly. In the voice of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is putting it down without knowing whether the person on the other end will accept it. I didn't tell her it was okay. Because it wasn't entirely okay, and I have learned, slowly, imperfectly, that saying things are okay when they aren't is a kind of lie that costs more than it saves. What I said was, I know. And then, because it was also true, I hope you're all right, Margaret. We haven't spoken since. I don't expect we will. Some things close without resolution, without the full accounting you imagined you'd need, and you discover that you can live inside that incompleteness, that closure is not the same as completion, and that you can be finished with something without it being entirely finished. I stood in a lawyer's office the day the acquisition closed. Marcus's office, a corner room on the 14th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of view that makes you understand why people want offices with views. It was a Thursday in October, gray outside, the city doing the thing it does in October where it looks simultaneously tired and beautiful. I signed the last document. Marcus handed me a copy. I held it for a moment. I thought about the 7-year-old who had been driven 4 hours in the back of a station wagon to a house where a 9-year-old had asked for a dog. I thought about the kitchen table where I had learned to be small and quiet and grateful for things that should have been given freely. I thought about the living room in November, the detective's notepad, my father's nod, my mother's floor-gazing silence, my brother's relief. I thought about 8 months of cold, precise preparation. About Claire's 3 questions in the interrogation room. About standing on courthouse steps in March in the cold, feeling not triumph but exhaustion. The long breath. I thought about all of it, and I felt, not satisfaction. Not triumph. Something more complicated and more honest than either of those. Something that had grief in it, still, even after everything. Because the thing I had wanted, when I was 7 years old in the back of that station wagon, was not a company or a stake or a software licensing agreement. It was simply to be someone's child. To be chosen and then to stay chosen. To have that mean something permanent. I never got that. And no acquisition closes that gap. No civil settlement, no amount of money, no moment of vindication. The gap is still there. It is just quieter now, and I have learned to live around it. Marcus asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. We sat for a while in that office with the gray October view and talked about nothing important, the way people do when something large has just finished and the ordinary world is quietly reasserting itself. Then I went home. People ask me, when I tell parts of this story, whether I feel like I won. Whether there is a satisfaction in how it ended, the clean karmic shape of it, the people who betrayed you ending up with less, the truth coming out the way truths are supposed to come out in stories. I understand why they ask. It does have that shape, from the outside. But from the inside it feels different. From the inside it feels like a very long walk that is finally over, and you are standing at the end of it, and your legs are tired, and the view is fine but you are mostly just glad to be still. I do not hate Daniel. I want to say that clearly. I do not spend time thinking about what his life looks like now, whether he is struggling, whether he lies awake in the way that people lie awake when they have done something they cannot undo. I genuinely do not know. And I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I don't need to know. His life is his. The consequences are his. They were always going to be his, I just had to wait long enough to stop being in the way of them. I do not hate Richard either. I think he was a man who loved his son in a way he could not equally extend, and who made a terrible decision when those two things came into conflict, and who has to live inside that decision now. That is its own kind of sentence. What I feel, most days, is something that took me a long time to identify because it was not what I expected to feel. It is something close to peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the clean, finished kind. But the peace of someone who knows exactly who they are and exactly what they are worth, not because the world confirmed it in some dramatic moment but because they kept the records, did the work, held on to what was theirs, and waited. I was adopted at 7 by a family that chose me and then, when it cost them something, chose differently. That is a true and painful thing. It is also not the whole story. The whole story includes the scholarship I won at 17 that no one in that house celebrated the way it deserved. The degree I paid for myself. The contracts I built. The system I designed with redundancies that saved me. The 31% I acquired, quietly and legally, because I had learned to protect what was mine. The whole story includes the fact that I was always more than what they saw when they looked at me. And the fact that they found that out the hard way does not fill the space where a family was supposed to be. But it does, on certain days, feel like a kind of answer. I live alone now, in an apartment that is the right size for one person and that I chose carefully and that I like very much. I work on projects that interest me. I sleep regular hours. I have a small number of friends who know the full story and a larger number of acquaintances who know pieces of it and a few people I am beginning to know who don't know any of it yet, which is its own particular pleasure, the pleasure of being a person before you are a story. Claire and I have dinner occasionally. She remains the sharpest person I know. Marcus sends a card every December. Small things. Good things. I think about the 7-year-old in the station wagon sometimes. What I would tell him if I could. I have thought about this enough to have an answer. I would tell him, keep the records. Not out of suspicion, out of self-respect. Know what is yours. Know what you built. Hold on to it carefully and don't let anyone tell you that wanting to keep what you earned is ingratitude or selfishness or the mark of someone who doesn't understand how family works. And I would tell him, the people who underestimate you are giving you something. It doesn't feel like a gift. But it is. It is time, and privacy, and the freedom to become something they aren't watching for. Use it. The truth did not announce itself dramatically. It did not arrive with thunder or ceremony or the kind of moment you could score with music. It arrived the way most true things arrive, in documents, in timestamps, in the patient accumulation of evidence that was always there, waiting for someone to look at it carefully enough. The people who betrayed me realized what they had done not in a single moment of revelation but slowly, in lawyers' offices and courtrooms and financial statements, in the gradual and ordinary way that consequences arrive when the thing you thought you controlled turns out to have been controlling itself all along. I was not there for most of it. I didn't need to be. Karma is not a dramatic thing. It is not thunder or lightning or a speech. It is a Tuesday. It is a document. It is a number on a page that means something different than you thought it meant. It is the moment you realize that the person you tried to remove from the picture was, in fact, the picture. I was always the picture. They just couldn't see it. They can now.